Hey, welcome back. This is Aaron Merritt. I want to welcome you back to the Bible Survey course, and this is Lesson 3 on the Pentateuch. Now, the Pentateuch describes the first 5 books of the Old Testament. That is Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. All 5 of those books share the same author, who we know of as Moses. Several passages in Scripture emphasize this fact. They're from 2nd Chronicles to Ezra, Nehemiah, Matthew, as Jesus himself says this is written by Moses, Mark, John, Paul affirms in Romans 10, 2 Corinthians 5. It's also supported by Josephus and the Baba Bathra. Now, Josephus was a 1st century Jewish historian, and he writes of these, 5 are the books of Moses, comprising the laws and the traditional history from the birth of man down to the death of the lawgiver. This period falls a little short of 3,000 years, as he writes it against Appian 1.37 to 42. The Baba Bathra is the Babylonian Talmud, written in the 2nd to 5th centuries A.D., and I quote, "Who wrote the scriptures? Moses wrote his own book and the portion of Balaam and Job." So they both Josephus and the rabbis of the Baba Bathra affirm that Moses was the author of the Pentateuch. Well, that may depend on when we understand that these books were written. The date of writing is usually assumed. This is the early date as opposed to the late date. The early date is approximately 1440 to 1400 BC. That is, this 3,000-year period was written within a period of about 40 years. The key issue for the Pentateuch is the identity of the Pharaoh of the Exodus. Popular consensus makes him out to be Ramses II, who reigned from 1290 to 1224 BC. Yet this late date fails several tests. You might, if you have a copy of the Archaeological Study Bible, take a look at page 106. We may take a look at that later on when we look at that particular section of the Scripture. A better date scheme is Thutmose III, who reigned from 1504 to 1450, and Amenhotep II, who reigned 1450 to 1426. These fit better as the pharaohs of oppression and the Exodus consecutively. Time period involved, as far as the text itself covers, is the beginning, from the beginning, as Archbishop Usher is fond of reminding us, 4004 BC. That's a debated date, but it's a good a date as any for us to work with for the time being, and all the way down to approximately 1400 BC. So let's take a look at Genesis. Genesis has an internal structure. You might not be aware of this, in what we call the Toledoth divisions. There are 10 of these in the book of Genesis, and they're usually set off by a phrase that's translated something to the effect, "This is the book of." This is the book of Adam. This is the book of Esau. This is the book of Joseph. This is the book of Judah, and so on. This is, you notice here, the 10 books that are listed in Genesis. I misspoke, not Joseph, Jacob. And the verse references. But the book of Genesis tends to have a rather brief outline, and I try to make these outlines brief and make them easier to understand. And that is creation itself, from the 1st chapter to the 4th verse of the 2nd chapter. The fall and the judgment, from the 5th verse of that 2nd chapter to chapter 9. The patriarchs, chapters 10 through 36. And then the passage of the journey to Egypt in chapters 37 to 50. You might be familiar with several of these significant characters: Adam and Noah, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. I might add here that Adam tends to fall out, the scripture, right after he's done. As soon as you get through the end of Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel, Adam himself just kind of drops out, and we don't read about Adam again until we get to the New Testament. That's a curious observation. As Christians, many disagree on the first chapter of Genesis. Did God create the world in 6 days or several millions of years? And we'll leave that for discussion, but I just make you aware of that. There's not a consensus as to what that creation is particularly. Let's take a look at the next book. The book of Exodus doesn't have the same internal structure as Genesis, but it does have an outline. We see a prologue there in the first 4 chapters as Moses goes from being, from the situation in which he's born, to being a man who is ready to take on the mantle of the deliverer. And of course, that deliverance takes place from chapters 5 to 18. That's when Moses goes back to Egypt and he says, "Let my people go," and Pharaoh is not as willing. And we go through the times of the plagues. The covenant takes place between chapters 19 and 24. This is where God lays out the initial covenant between himself and Israel. We learn also in Exodus of God's true name, as listed there at the bottom of the screen, the YHWH, also known as the Tetragrammaton. And then from chapters 25 to 40, we have the construction of the tabernacle, gathering the materials, equipping the men to build it, and completing that tabernacle till it comes to the climax there in chapter 40, and the flame descends from heaven, and God takes his residence with and among the people of Israel. And so, of course, we meet in Exodus God himself, Moses, Aaron, Pharaoh, Jethro, Miriam, and all the other cast of characters in Exodus. Leviticus is more of a challenge. Leviticus does have a structure, but Leviticus presents to us kind of in a almost a ritualized, formalized form, this idea of what it means to interact with God. A lot of the laws and rules that we tend to associate with the Israelites are found in Leviticus. The ritual of sacrifice takes place between chapters 1 and 16. How to offer sacrifices for sin, thank offerings, heave offerings, a whole host of things on how to get right and absolve himself of sin before God through offering and sacrifice. And there's the idea of practice. What does it mean to be in this new nation? We see these in chapter 17 to 22. How does that govern our behavior? What does that mean to us? Chapters 23 to 25, we see the feasts that the Jews were to observe annually, the Israelites observe annually. And then finally, a couple of chapters of exhortation there at the end. You need to do this, don't do that, and so on and so forth. So Leviticus, many people approach Leviticus as kind of a tough book to get into and get through, and it is a lot of ritualistic language, things that we're not familiar with, that kind of outside our comfort zone. But if you take the time to dig through Leviticus, it is a very satisfying work. The fourth book of the Pentateuch is the book of Numbers. And the book of Numbers tells us a lot about the journey. When they get ready to leave Sinai, they've had the Ten Commandments, they've had the basic set of rituals and customs they're to observe now that they're this new nation. So Numbers presents to us kind of a, how do we get from there to the promised land. So they prepare to leave in those first 10 chapters, get things packed, kind of put things together. And then the next 10 chapters is the Sinai to Kadesh. It's not Kadesh, it should be Kadesh. So they leave Mount Sinai and they get to Kadesh Barnea, which is the southern part of the land of Canaan. And here's where we meet the 12 spies. We see Korah who usurps Moses and tries to take control himself, take the people back to Egypt, because they go through all kinds of different trials and tribulations. But then you get to chapter 20, and the next 12 chapters, Kadesh to Moab. There is this journey where we've viewed the land, we've looked at the land, and now we have to wander a bit. We're going to wander in the wilderness for 40 years. And we meet this in character called Balaam, who is a God-fearer for all intents and purposes, but uses his connection with God to profit himself. This is an Old Testament Simon Magus, as it were. And he is called by King Balak to come and curse the Israelites. And we see his story there in Numbers. And then the last 4 chapters, just a summary, everywhere we've been, and now we're ready to go into the promised land. So you see the characters there, Korah and Balaam and Balak and Phinehas. Phinehas becomes the new high priest after the death of his brothers. The Ammonites, the Moabites, Joshua and Caleb. We move to Deuteronomy. The last book of the law, book of Deuteronomy, is a book that primarily concerns itself with reviewing with this new generation what the law is. The Deuteronomy was necessary because when the Israelites had passed through 40 years in the wilderness, there was a whole new generation that's come up that did not witness Sinai, that did not witness the plagues. They have to be retaught what it is to be Israelite. So you have this prologue, this kind of a review of things, of how did we get there from here, how did we get here from there, and so on. Then we have a renewal of the covenant from the end of the 4th chapter to the 26th chapter. This is what the covenant is, and it starts with the 10 Commandments and goes into all the laws that we've seen before, but has some different nuances to them. And then the ratification of that law with the Israelites is there in Genesis 27 or Deuteronomy 27 to 30. This is Mount Gerizim, Mount Ebal, the blessings and the curses, and the people in the valley echoing what they will do and what they won't do. And in the last couple of chapters, this is where Deuteronomy gets a little fishy, where we've said up to this point that Moses has been the author of the Pentateuch. And he has and is, and these last couple of chapters of Deuteronomy speak of Moses' death and then the events that happen after that. So the question becomes, well, how did this happen? Did Moses write these things beforehand? Did God kind of lay out for Moses what it would be like, what his death would be like? I think it'd be easier for us to believe that Joshua simply took up where Moses left off and finishes the book in preparation for his own book, the book of Joshua. So it's just a brief survey of the Pentateuch. Hope you enjoyed that. Again, each of these pieces are meant to be part of a larger whole, but this is it's meant to be kind of an introduction, a basic introduction to these different books, some of the issues involved, and I invite you to comment or let me know what you think about it, and look forward to hearing from you. Thank you very much.